now let us turn to the Jewish background culture that's going on at the time. Of course, the Jews live under Roman rule and under the Roman Empire at this time, and most of them don't like it. They have frictions with the Romans and so forth and so on, but nevertheless, the Romans have ultimate power and they have to comply. But there are going to be uprisings here and there, and ultimately this is going to lead to the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70, and then there will even another revolt in 135, the Bar Kokhba rebellion. But part of all these rebellions and part of this friction and so forth goes back to the Jewish culture known as Second Temple Judaism, which was rife with messianic expectations. So there are many Jews who are hoping for, they're looking forward to a Messiah that will come, a Savior, someone who will liberate them, first and foremost, from Roman oppression and Roman rule, and then someone who will also bring about the restoration of Israel and to reinstate it to its ancient glories back from the time of Solomon and David and so forth, okay? And to give it its rightful place among the nations and be respected, okay? Make them somebody again, throw off the oppression of the Romans, okay? So now, why is it called Second Temple Judaism? Well, let's go back and look at the history of the temple. You know, it first started off as a tabernacle in the wilderness as the Israelites wandered coming out of Egypt in the Exodus. And so it was a tent, and it was a very elaborate tent. If you go back and read the details, it's quite an exquisite tent. But eventually, David wanted to build a temple. He was not allowed to because of his sins against the Lord. But he was allowed to collect all of the materials, and his son Solomon built the first temple. Okay, and so the first temple that is built in place is Solomon's temple, and it was destroyed in 537 B.C. And after 50 years in exile, the Israelites were led away in exile. But after 50 years in exile, they were allowed to come back, and some of them began to reconstruct the temple. And it took about 2 or 3 decades for this to happen. In 515 BC, the second temple was complete. And so this is the period of the second temple. So you see, there are times in Jewish history where they live with the temple and times when they live without the temple. But the temple is a central part of their culture and their religion and their understanding of their relationship with God. Now, this second temple was later profaned by Antiochus Epiphanes in 167 BC, which was a horrific act for the Jews. And then it was purified and rededicated by Judas Maccabeus in 164 BC. And forever thereafter celebrated in a feast of dedication that we call Hanukkah. Okay, this is referred to in John 10:22, where John mentions this very feast. Well, around 20 BC, Herod the Great, the leader of the Jews, the king of the Jews, extensively expanded and aggrandized the temple. Now, this is just what rulers did back then. For example, Nero is going to burn Rome because he wants a big place in the middle of the city of Rome to build a temple. So a lot of the rulers at that time, the more powerful they were, would engage in grand building projects to leave a legacy, for example, to leave some kind of a living legacy. So a temple, a building, some type of grand structure, palace, were choice things to leave a legacy. So Herod takes it upon himself to greatly expand the temple. So he's going to revamp it, expand it, and rebuild it. So this is a 46-year-long project, and it took great expense to do this. It was a giant complex with colonnades and courts and so forth and so on. Those even took longer than the temple itself. When it finally came to its completion, it would only exist 10 years before the Romans would come and destroy it in AD 70. So it was completed around AD 60, but it became useful, or it went into service, so to speak, 46 years after he began it in 20 BC. Okay. Now, you have to understand a lot of these dates, people didn't use those dates back then. They used other types of ways to zero in on dates and so forth. So we're just, using contemporary dating here. Well, the destruction of this temple in AD 70 and the destruction of Jerusalem was much like a 9/11 moment for the Jews. And it also had deep implications for Christians as well. It was a pivotal moment in which the Romans had kind of had it up to here, so to speak, with Jewish rebellions. Now, part of those rebellions had been sparked by persecution. The Romans had persecuted Jews and Christians and so forth, especially under Nero from 64 to 68. And so there was a lot of friction between Jews, Christians, and Romans on these issues. And so in AD 70, finally, or in 69, the Romans go and lay siege to the city of Jerusalem and finally take it and destroy the temple. And like I said, this is an epic moment for Jews and Christians. In a way, there's no turning back. You can imagine, well, now finally, even the second temple's been destroyed. So the whole Jewish religion has to shift. And it shifts away from being temple-based to being based in synagogues. So that now Jews go to synagogue wherever they are in the world, and that's the center of their culture, their teaching, their rabbis, and so forth. So the rabbis are not priests, they're teachers of the law, but they're not priests, and they do not perform priestly duties. So Judaism shifts from being a priestly-based form of religion to being one based upon teachings and commentary on the Torah and so forth, okay? Now that has an impact upon Christianity as well. For example, we see Jesus called rabbi in several places, that is teacher, okay? So many people looked at him as a Rabboni, a teacher.